this podcast, I am presenting an overview, an extended summary, one could say, of Kill All Normies, a book that was written in 2017 by Angela Nagle. The subtitle of the book is Online Culture Wars from 4chan and Tumblr to Trump and the Alt-Right, which explains its subject matter. From time to time, I may make minor personal observations on the material or give some external context, which I will make obvious as being my layperson's contributions, but the following, for the most part, is almost entirely Nagle's thesis. I highly recommend that the listener reads the book. Nagle's important account of a digital subcultural phenomenon and its real-life implications is incisive, entertaining, largely unbiased and packed with information, and yet it's also refreshingly short and easy to read. Given that everything is so fleeting and forgotten nowadays, especially in the digital world, this record of a peculiar time is invaluable. Before getting into the book, I want to offer a definition of the phrase culture wars. It is the conflict between traditional conservative values and socially progressive or liberal values as it takes place in the Western world. That is to say, progressivism versus orthodoxy. The phrase entered the common language in the 1990s to illustrate the polarization that had happened, especially in the US, around issues such as abortion, gun laws, environmental issues, migration, rights to privacy, drug use, censorship, and LGBT rights. Public morality is the defining issue in the culture wars. The war, in fact, is the conflict over the power to define what is right and what is wrong. It includes issues already mentioned, plus, for example, worldviews on euthanasia, capital punishment, feminism, the age of consent, pornography, sex work, and so on, and of course, political correctness. I went online first in about 2010 and quickly gravitated towards subjects that interested me, such as fringe politics and esoteric matters. On the social media that catered for such interests, I came upon an unusual breed, the professedly Christian, either regular or more often Gnostic, males who had strong ideas on political conspiracies and who often generated complex theories of everything. The occult and science fiction was a pervasive element in these spaces, I discovered. Fight Club was the go-to movie, for example, for the more politically inclined, while The Matrix was the scripture for those with esoteric bents. I had not been overly impressed by either movie, beyond entertainment, so I was somewhat surprised to observe this heightened conditioning of minds emerge from the world of film. After all, film is notoriously propagandistic, and these people claim to have seen behind the curtain. In any event, these personalities were mild-mannered and harmless, with occasional guru complexes at worst, and especially when compared to the vile inhabitants of the world of 4chan, as Nagle has described them, though they were undoubtedly chauvinists and bigots with ill-disguised racist and anti-Semitic tendencies. I have no experience at all of the spaces that Nagle details in her book, though I think the places I frequented were on the better-behaved fringe of this movement. Interestingly, Nagle does not delve at all into the esoteric or occult connection with respect to the online alt-right, but I hazard a guess that it is a subtle but nonetheless influential undercurrent, if not a foundation. It breaks cover briefly in the narrative of the Keck meme, whereby the online alt-right seemed to hold some idea that they had memed Trump into power with some kind of chaos magic. At that time, I was completely unaware of the online raptured churches of the ultra-progressive left, though these spaces are more within my sights nowadays. Their online contributions, as I monitor them now, are reminiscent in strange ways of the evangelical soft right I had earlier encountered. Both are very self-righteous, proselytizing and arrogant in their own ways, though the leftist spaces have, perhaps ironically, a complete deficit of charm and fun. The earlier culture wars of the 1960s and again in the 1990s involved hoary old conservatives battling in the real world with youthful insurrection. But by the beginning of the 2010s, a new online battleground had emerged, and the troops gathered on the right included gamers, anime fans, anti-feminist pranksters, nerds and trolls. Below the radar of the mainstream media, a war raged between them and the online left over feminism, gender identity, sexuality, racism, free speech, and political correctness. The factor connecting the loose coalition to the right was their gleeful delight in mocking the self-righteous liberals, who had become ever more sanctimonious, preachy and narcissistic, and were engaged in constant po-faced virtue signalling. This pious left wing had also influenced the mainstream to such an extent that they were now the establishment, and the right-wing rebels had become the culture-jamming subversives. The online alt-right were probably as surprised as anyone when Trump won the election in 2016. But now they found themselves in the spotlight. They were a talked-about force. Although the alt-right tried to make out after the result that they had operated as the voice of the disenfranchised, the truth is that they were, and are, just as elitist and snobby as the leftists had become towards the ordinary folk. They were just as afraid of or repulsed by the masses, who they referred to as normies, and yet there was Milo Yiannopoulos somehow making speeches about the working class in the aftermath of the election results. The alt-right were working quickly by the end of 2016 to attempt to reshape themselves as a populist movement. This was not, however, their natural form ever. They had been the geeks and the nerds, the sexually and culturally dispossessed, who had sought to keep out the average technologically inept normie from their online spaces. Nietzsche, one of their heroes, had after all said that a declaration of war on the masses by higher men is needed. They did not consider themselves to be of the people. The masses were the lamestream, beneath even contempt. And as well as being contemptuous of the wider mass of normies, they were also scornful of the basic bitches, as they were called, who were the geeky girls who were trying to infiltrate their spaces. After all, there are no girls on the internet. There has consistently been violent rejection of any attempt by the outside matriarchy, as they see it, to encroach upon their spaces. As Tyler Durden said in Fight Club, "Why do you and I know what a duvet is?" So who are this online alt-right, and how did they get to be the force they apparently are or might be? This is the subject matter that concerns Nagle. She points out that in 2008, Obama's online campaign was characterised by hope, whether that was cynical or not, and I am more inclined to believe the former. And many in the mainstream and online still believed that the online space could be a cyber utopia, where big new bright ideas could emerge, evolve and spread like digital wildfire. During the early 2010s, we had the Arab Spring, Occupy, Anonymous, WikiLeaks, all apparently huge grassroots movements coalescing around social media. It seemed that technology was breaking down old social barriers and creating a radical new networked global society. But then the Arab Spring was quickly routed by tyranny, Occupy was evicted, and what looked like social movements often descended into mob rule. An early indicator that all was not well in the new world of online radicalism, according to Nagle, was the Kony 2012 campaign. This involved a video decrying the Ugandan military leader Joseph Kony, which was circulated and went absolutely viral. People who had never even heard of Uganda, much less Kony, were sharing heartfelt pleas to have him overthrown. The video had tens of millions of views. But then Ugandans themselves began to criticise the video, and they mocked it for inaccuracies. And this caused a corresponding rush of virtue signalling, where people began to criticise and mercilessly shame those who had shared the video previously. This was a news cycle that was to repeat itself ad nauseum over the next few years, and the earlier semblance of hope for online activism was gradually replaced by a jaded cynicism. This cynicism Nagle exemplifies with the Haramba incident. A gorilla was shot when a child fell into a zoo enclosure, and at first people rushed to condemn the father of the child. This led to a response, a burst of meme-making mockery that culminated in ironic campaigns with slogans like "Dicks out for Harambe." The intention was to mock the self-righteous, neurotic sentimentality of the clicktivists. This level of mockery had happened before online, but with Harambe, for some reason, it went mainstream. Mainly, Nagle suggests, because the meme was now meeting with fertile ground in increasing public irritation with pervasive leftists preaching at them. The online mockery and savage humour was a welcome relief from liberal self-righteousness and the toxic absurdities of US identity politics. There was also a terrible dark side emerging alongside this playful, post-ironic transgression. For example, Leslie Jones, an actress in Ghostbusters, was compared to a black dude by Milo Yiannopoulos and had Harambe memes directed towards her. Her website was hacked and nudes were circulated. It seems then that what would come to be known as the alt-right concealed far more sinister elements, who were perhaps tolerating the pranksters as useful idiots. Real-deal racists, anti-Semites and ultranationalists were undercover in the online right. Fascist ideologues like Richard Spencer, for example. Spencer is an example of an element of the political right that had grown contemptuous of mainstream conservatives for their passivity, their religious values, and mainly for failing to win the previous culture wars. This radical element formed part of the new online alt-right, and they pushed ideas about cultural decadence and the clash of civilizations, for example. These people were also technologically very savvy. This new right could not hope to win over disenfranchised youngsters, however, with long intellectual theses on ideas. And so this is where the short, sharp and deadly humour of the 4chan and 8chan arenas came into play. But before going on, it's worth asking why these youngsters were disenfranchised in the first place, and why were they such ripe pickings? One theory, which Nagle herself endorses elsewhere, is that there was nowhere else for teenage boys to go when they felt personally insulted from being so often personally insulted by the mainstream culture. The online left, which Nagle expounds upon later, were drumming out weird, radical ideology, ideas that were completely intolerant of critique from their platforms like Tumblr, and there just had to be a backlash. But I would like to also offer an earlier locus of possible enculturation. In the very early 2000s, I noticed my teenage son, who was then 14 years old or so, playing a violent video game, and I asked him, did he not find it disturbing? Now, the game was very mild compared to what was available then, and positively innocent compared to what is available now. Nah, he responded, don't you know that we're all desensitized now? This was a remark that really stuck with me. This concept of desensitization is not mentioned by Nagle, but it would have preceded the online culture wars. Violent video games had been around for quite some time and could have provided some of the context for the later casual cruelty and detached irony that so characterises the online alt-light. Perhaps post-ironic nihilism had already been adopted by many intelligent young males long before the online culture wars ever took off. Another factor that Nagle mentions, but in a different context than one I propose as causal, is pornography. In an interview, she suggested that some boys could have been traumatised by the depravity of the porn available online, and that this in some way drove some of them towards a visceral rejection of the sexual revolution. Somewhat later than the incident I just recounted above, my young teenage daughter told me of a practice in her very rural school where the boys would pounce on the girls and force them to watch clips of extreme and violent online porn on their phones. The girls, of course, were very disturbed by this. This was, for some of them, their first encounter with sex education, if it could be called that. So it is my contention that this extreme and pervasive pornography may be partially responsible for some of the success of radical online movements that have attracted not only boys but also girls, and in their case more so to the ghettos of the far left, such as the online trans cult. Another factor not mentioned by Nagle is the huge increase in mental health issues among the youth. Up to 10% of US children are heavily medicated before puberty, and a significant number of them have been medicated from infancy for depression, anxiety, ADHD and so on. A schools inspector from the UK told me in the mid-2000s that there was no staff room in any school in the country that was not littered with bottles of Ritalin. This unexplained increase in childhood adversity and medical intervention, not to mention exploding rates of autism, must have some bearing on both the radical transgressiveness of the online youth culture which later ensued and which included the alt-right, and on the extreme neuroticism and emotionality of the virtue signallers across the aisle on the left wing. But anyway, back to the chans. The alt-left youth were gradually eased out of the chan spaces by the alt-right youth. There were viral memes that emerged from these spaces then that were light in nature. For example, lolcats originated there, and rickrolling. But there were also memes rooted in dark anime, memes that were increasingly misogynistic, and memes based on The Matrix and Fight Club, of course. Gory porn and transgressiveness began to pervade the space. There were also dreadful trolling campaigns, such as, for example, when a random 11-year-old girl called Jessie Slaughter was mercilessly bullied by swarms of Chan users. Kek also emerged on the Chans. The word was a translation of the word lol from World of Warcraft, and also an ancient frog-headed Egyptian god. Nagle doesn't cover this area, but Kek merged with a previous Chan symbol of Pepe the Frog, and became an emblematic meme for the online alt-right. Kek in the Egyptian pantheon represents darkness, obscurity and the unknown, which of course was seen as entirely appropriate and synchronistic. Kek, or Cook, also represented the bringer of the light, and for the occupants of the Chans, they had decided upon Donald Trump for this function. The online right began to attribute all their good fortune and success to their frog-headed deity and to a form of chaos magic. But this is an aside not covered in the book, so we will move on. The online culture wars gathered apace. The leftist Tumblr progressives were increasingly pushing the boundaries of gender, sexuality, etc. And the more that they did this, the more the response became increasingly misogynistic and debased. Both sides in their own ways were hysterical and insane, but they undoubtedly fed off each other. The Tumblr left were known for calling each other out on ridiculous misdemeanours, seeing trigger and threat in the silliest of things, from reading Shakespeare to wearing certain Halloween costumes. And they were also highly motivated to publicly shame people for being thought criminals, including their own erstwhile comrades, in order to gain social credit. But the difference was that their ambit of influence was not only online. Unlike the alt-right, the leftists had gained some power on the campuses where they sought to ruin people's lives, careers and reputations with their brand of ultra-woke puritanism. The reactions mounted by the alt-right in some ways reflected a broader public reaction to certain cultural preoccupations. There was growing opposition in the offline world to extreme political correctness, to third-wave feminism, to enforced multiculturalism. The alt-right was highly motivated to push back against the holier-than-thou liberals with their prissy wokeness. The Chan reaction, however, was extreme to the point of being sinister. Feminist bloggers, for example, were regularly doxed, that is, their phone numbers and addresses were made public online, and liberal progressives were viciously trawled with depraved imagery and sexual threats sent their way. There was a significant influence on the alt-right online movement from the male separatist movements like MGTOW and the pickup artistry sites, and this influence bred a particularly chaotic form of misogyny. Modern radical feminism has, in many cases, engendered a radical anti-male narrative, and there has been a masculinist response. This diverse culture of respondents has come to be known as the manosphere. It travels the whole gamut from simple health advice for men to red-pilled incels, and it is this latter end of the spectrum which has proved to be a good recruiting ground for the alt-right. The mild-mannered blokes are considered by the radical masculinists to be manginas and cooks. There are good and rational reasons why there has been this backlash against a feminist culture, which has tended to create a lot of antagonism towards men. But the reaction has in many cases been very ugly and very depraved. This raging chauvinism has fueled the online right for sure. One of the contradictions in the manosphere is the glorification of both pornified sex and yet a hatred towards sexually liberated women and the elevation of the idealised housewife. This cohort of the online right often come across as vengeful and sex-starved. Constant rejection has driven some of them towards extremism and in some cases, like Elliot Rodger, to mass murder. This online alt-right would probably have remained underground or insignificant were it not for a wider circle that became known as the alt-light, which included social media influencers like Milo Yiannopoulos, Mike Cernovich, Gavin McInnes, I don't know how to pronounce his name, and the help of armies of playful, pranksterish, youthful meme makers. It is undeniable that the alt-right end of the culture wars has mastered transgressive meme-making to a far greater extent than the alt-left, and this is probably because they have the vast arsenal of dark humour and mischief at their disposal. The left are simply too po-faced to be funny. The alt-right was, and still is, buzzing with a Loki-style wickedness. Nagle outlines in detail the story of Gamergate, which I am very glad never to have been aware of at the time. It was essentially a hate campaign that was mounted against Anita Sarkeesian, who had been making feminist YouTubes and who had dared to suggest that video games ought to take cognizance of feminist ideas. Apart from all the details of the case, what Gamergate did was unite the disparate factions of the loose coalition that was the online alt-right, from the gamers themselves, to the anti-feminist manosphere, to the wider alt-light who were just fed up of PC bullcrap, and of course the more ideologically motivated, politically serious alt-right. They coalesced around the idea that this was a challenge to their freedom of expression and that feminists would not be permitted to encroach with their ideology into video game territory. It is ironic that the whole campaign to prove that there was no sexism in video games descended into such degenerate sexism itself. Many female video game reviewers were left feeling terrified. One games designer called Patricia Hernandez dubbed 4chan a cathedral of misogyny. But the reactionaries on the right were not all hate-filled misogynists, far from it. Many had simply had enough of this ideological spread or creep, and there were also many rational and moderate voices to the left and the centre who were recognising how aspects of feminism have been weaponised against men. And it is also true that some flanks of feminism had sought to take control over the ethos of video games. So some could understand the fearsome backlash against an attempt at an ideological coup. Regardless of the moderate voices on either side, it was clear that the dream of cyberspace being a leaderless utopia, a digital autonomous zone, romantically infused by creative freedom, was long gone. Instead, it had been co-opted by fringe extremists from both sides, two armies doubling down, the hardcore progressives on one side and the self-styled beta revolutionaries on the other. One of the most interesting aspects of the online culture war has been the co-opting by the right of the tool of transgression. Transgression had always been considered a weapon of the left prior to this. It was the conservatives who were supposed to be the fuddy-duddies. The online right's mastery of nonconformity have marked them out as being very different than any earlier traditionalist conservative movement. Nagle notes that social transgressiveness has its roots in the influence of the Marquis de Sade. Milo Yiannopoulos compares the online right to the punk movement. Perhaps it was merely an accident of history that transgressiveness was formally associated with the left. I would also remark that perhaps the category of right is not a totally good fit for these online reactionaries. Perhaps they could have as many claims on being called anarchists or just plain old anti-authoritarian libertarians as they have on being called right-wing. Some on the online right view the transgressiveness as satirical performance art, as aggressive rhetoric or culture jamming. A common trope among the Chans is the movie American Psycho, which has strong influences from sadism. The postmodernists had in the past repackaged madness as a creative state, one that seeks to throw off the shackles of imposed morality. And the online right have repackaged this repackaging in order to throw off the imposed leftist morality. One of the primary motivators of this transgression seems to be a desire to violently repudiate mainstream sentimentality. This is manifested, for example, in vicious trolling campaigns against random murder or suicide victims, a practice which is known as RIP trolling. Sentimentality, it has to be said, has been elevated to an art form by the online left. There is nothing that they cannot emote hysterically over. This, of course, has fed into the baleful desire of the online right to engage in their vice of grotesque overreaction. The philosopher Nietzsche is influential among the alt-right, and Nietzsche also sought to overthrow the moral order via transgression. Many of the online alt-right also share Nietzsche's view of Christianity as being a slave morality. George Bataille, who was influenced by de Sade, lauded what he called purposeless excess, especially as a reaction to boredom and nihilism. And we can certainly see this purposeless excess everywhere in the Chan culture, where there are huge efforts devoted to trolling and meme making, which is ultimately ephemeral. And as successful as the left have used transgression as a weapon in past culture wars, the right have undeniably been the masters of malevolent mischief in this particular war. Alt-writers like Milo Yiannopoulos and Alan Bokhari trace the roots of the online right to various intellectuals and philosophies, including, for example, Oswald Spengler, the German anti-democrat, H.L. Mencken, an admirer of Nietzsche, a racist, and another critic of representative democracy, Julius Evola, the traditionalist, and the French New Right, which had emerged in the 1960s and had adopted the theories of people like Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci, who was a neo-Marxist, believed that the state and ruling classes use cultural institutions to maintain power in capitalist societies. This is an important idea. The French New Right also blended characteristics of both the left and the right, which is what the online alt-right have also been doing. The online right, or at least its intellectuals, took stock of the fact that the cultural dominance since the 1960s culture wars has no longer been reflexively conservative, and thus they decided that the whole culture has to be retaken. In this mission, there has been some considerable success, though I would hazard a guess that this may be as much a result of the extremity of the progressive leftist stand on cultural matters as it is a victory for right-wing thought. Milo has also invoked Pat Buchanan's 1992 culture war speech as an inspiration for the online right. Buchanan's supporters were also opposed to globalization, uncontrolled immigration, and they valued cultural inheritance, family values, and so on. It has to be said, however, that the new online right are very far removed from the buttoned-up, church-going conservatives of yore. The failure of those conservatives to hold back the tide in earlier culture wars results in the online right being contemptuous of these passive, often mild-mannered folk who were their political forefathers. That historical right had also often failed to embrace some of the sharper intellectuals in their midst who had advocated for more aggressive methods and for astute argumentation against liberal dogma. Many of these conservatives eventually migrated to the left, the intellectuals, but the new right seems to be very open to embracing acerbic confrontation, at least, if not so much well-argued thesis. The alt-right also draws some inspiration from Alexander Dugin, who amalgamates philosophies of traditionalism, empire building, fascism and esotericism. Dugin sees the modern men as feminized. Women, he reckons, should be confined to breeding, especially in a racially pure manner, of course, and he expresses utter contempt for what he calls the modern soulless world. Social media has, to a large extent, superseded the influence of the mainstream media, and media is always central in modern societies to the formation of culture. The left wing had developed an influential online presence during Obama's presidency, with sites like BuzzFeed and Salon and Upworthy. Though, as Nagle correctly says, these sites were often saccharine and sentimental, full of feel-good articles and clickbaits, and above all, ultra-sensitive. They were, in essence, ripe for mockery. Not only did these sites push leftist ideas like toxic masculinity and cultural appropriation, but they also began to turn on their own in what we now know, or what we now call call-out culture. They derided fellow leftists as the testosterone left or the white left, and Bernie Sanders was smeared online by leftists first. And all of this was a great boost for Trump, as it left the field wide open for Hillary. The part of the left that was being mocked by their fellow comrades did try to kick back against this ultra-progressive movement, but the backlash from the alt-right dwarfed their attempts. The alt-right was constructing its own online social media presence. People like Steve Bannon, for example, and Breitbart, YouTubers who made SJW cringe compilations, and God knows there was plenty of easy pickings for such videos. And Milo Yiannopoulos was making a career out of mockery. He was attracting huge audiences on campuses both sides of the Atlantic. Rebel Media produced stars like Gavin McInnes and Lauren Southern. Mike Cernovich was another alt-right celebrity. Ben Shapiro emerged from the alt-right, though he eventually criticised Breitbart for its anti-Semitism and found himself at the mercy of vicious abuse, including from Milo. And of course there was also Alex Jones, a huge name, though perhaps somewhat more challenged now due to his deplatforming by Apple and YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. A more serious figure in the sense of his far-right credentials is Richard Spencer, a man who advocates for a white homeland to be achieved via peaceful ethnic cleansing, whatever that is. When Trump was elected, he addressed a crowd with the words, "Hail Trump, hail our leader," evoking Nazi salutes among his audience. Spencer, however, is not universally popular among the online alt-right, because some see him as a form of controlled opposition, a plant perhaps being used to discredit the movement. Because, as always happens, success brings its own troubles, and the election of Trump has caused the right movement to begin to splinter in some places. Nagle points out that Trump versus Hillary was the real-world manifestation of this culture war that was happening online, and which heretofore the left had been winning before the emergence of this new, youthful and transgressive online force. The left thus far had lost the economics war and have turned more and more towards identity politics as the central axis of their ongoing cultural war. A point to consider is that the left pushing the boundary in the realm of identity politics is often used to mask other activities such as persistent warmongering and scorched earth economic policies. But the traditional base for the left, supposedly the working class, do not in general feel any great affiliation for this burgeoning leftist identity politics. In response to some of the more radical campaigns from the left, such as transsexual rights or cultural relativism, or as we have recently witnessed, abortion on demand, even up to birth, the old political base have begun to revert in response towards a more natural cultural conservatism. Though the online right is transgressive, they do still equate moral and sexual decadence with civilizational decline. And so, to this extent, one could say that they are in touch with the feelings of a wider audience in the real world. The gay issue has long since become boring, even for the alt-right, and yet the alt-right still does point the finger of blame for cultural decay towards radical feminism, gender theory, and the push for multiculturalism. This is a popular real-world opinion too. Milo Yiannopoulos has said that the alt-right is primarily a reaction to the nannying and language policing and authoritarianism of the progressive left. Nagle delves more deeply into the manifestations of this new radical left, the ultra-progressives who populate platforms such as Tumblr. The rhetoric in these online ghettos of the left has grown increasingly anti-white, anti-straight, anti-male and anti-cis. The alt-left are always preachy and puritanical, always in search of insult. And though they are radical, they are also extremely sensitive, unlike their battle-hardened opponents on the online alt-right. This would have been of little importance had the online left not somehow managed to be remarkably successful in pushing their ideas into the mainstream. Suddenly, especially in the universities, there were calls for safe spaces and multiple genders, gender fluidity, biological denialism, endless pronouns, trigger warnings, no platformings, checking of privilege, and the curbing of all free speech insofar as it ever threatened to challenge their preferred ideologies. Intersectional identity politics has sought to divide people according to their victim status. This competitive victimhood first spawned on the Tumblr space, where a call-out and punishment culture was established. The most influential thinker by far on the online far left was and is Judith Butler, a gender theorist, who argues in deeply postmodernist style that all gender and sexuality is performative, it is all socially constructed. Thus, people can legitimately identify as animals, angels, demons. An adult can identify as a baby, as disabled. And of course, anyone can identify from childhood as one of constantly multiplying numbers of genders. Leftist online politics has become an orgy of bearing witness to suffering. Mental health issues and vulnerability are badges of honour. Worse still, white cis people constantly self-flagellate in these spaces, checking their privilege compulsively. But combined with this fetish for fragility, there is also a vicious streak that delights in publicly shaming other people and that bursts forth in virulent attacks on those who will not accept the gospel of the woke. Nagle theorises that one motivating factor for this public purging and shaming has been the creation of virtue credit scarcity, so that the woke must squabble and fight amongst themselves for the crumbs of social kudos. This purging impulse has spread to the campuses, where people like Germaine Greer, for example, have been deplatformed as supposed transphobes, and there have been hysterical campaigns where victim groups claim to be triggered to the point of PTSD. Others deplatformed include, for example, Peter Tatchell, who is a lifelong gay activist, and then when the Iranian socialist Maryam Namazi came to speak in Goldsmith University in London, she was severely harassed by the Islamic Society because she was daring to speak in support of secularism. And the leftists all came down in favour of the Islamic Society against Maryam Namazi, even though the president of the Islamic Society has supported homophobia. This is the arena of the online culture wars. Toxic, inhuman behaviour has made the left a laughingstock, according to Nagle. The online left has become neurotic, while the online right remains shocking and transgressive, weird and fun and punk, and thus perhaps, in spite of its vileness, even courageous. The more the fans of Judith Butler push at the boundaries of wokeness, the more the online right gleefully break all their rules. And, as Nagle concludes, winning people over to ideas via debate, discussion, sharing of opinions has become ever more difficult in such a poisonous atmosphere.